The Vietnam War brought together armies from across the world, each carrying its own history, doctrine, and way of fighting. Among them, the Americans and Australians stood side by side, sharing bases, sharing battles, and facing the same enemy. But the way they moved, the way they patrolled, and the way they understood the jungle could not have been more different. At first, these differences caused confusion. Later, they shaped some of the most important lessons of the war. American forces arrived in Vietnam with clear strengths. They had numbers, firepower, helicopters, and confidence in their style of warfare. Their doctrine focused on aggressive maneuver. Find the enemy, pin him down, and destroy him through overwhelming force. It was a system built on mobility, armor, artillery, and air support. It worked well in open terrain or large-scale operations. It matched American industrial strength and their belief in decisive action. Australian forces, though far smaller in number, arrived with something different: generations of bush knowledge. Their army had grown up fighting in jungles, from New Guinea in World War II to Malaya during the emergency. Australian soldiers spent years mastering the skills needed for dense terrain. Silent movement, slow tracking, patience, observation, and small unit independence. To them, Vietnam felt familiar. The jungle was dangerous, but it was not new. These two approaches were not better or worse, just built for different environments. But early in the war, they clashed in subtle ways. American commanders sometimes looked at Australian operations and saw a pace that felt too slow. A single Australian platoon might move only a few kilometers in a day, stopping often to listen, to check sign, or to read the terrain. Americans, used to covering large areas quickly, struggled to understand the logic. They wanted to sweep wide zones, make contact fast, and deliver firepower early. To their eyes, the Australians seemed overly cautious. Australians, on the other hand, watched American units and saw a different problem: noise. Big formations, close spacing, fast movement, and frequent helicopter traffic meant the Viet Cong often heard Americans long before they arrived. Australians believed the jungle punished noise and rewarded silence. To them, American tactics gave the enemy too many warnings. Imagine two Allied units stepping into the same forest with the same mission: find the Viet Cong. One unit moves as a tight column, weapons ready, pushing forward with speed. The other spreads out, meters between each soldier, checking every track and stopping often to listen. Both intend to win. Both are brave. Both are skilled. But to each other, the methods look almost the opposite. The Americans trusted firepower. The Australians trusted stealth. Soldiers on both sides of this Allied partnership learned quickly that neither approach was simple. American troops carried heavy loads: radios, ammunition, grenades, and rations. Their gear clattered against metal. Their boots snapped sticks. Their patrols relied on constant communication. This was not because they lacked discipline. It was because their doctrine assumed the need for rapid support. If contact occurred, they expected helicopters and artillery to respond within minutes. Noise did not worry them as much because firepower could break an ambush. Australians carried lighter loads and fewer soldiers, often just 20 to 30 men in a platoon. They spread out more, used hand signals, and relied on sight and hearing instead of constant radio chatter. Their training taught them that the first shot in a jungle fight often decided everything. If they were seen first, things could go bad quickly. If they saw the enemy first, they controlled the fight. This core belief created a different soldier mindset. Australian soldiers became experts at reading the bush. They watched for tiny signs: a bent leaf, a fresh footprint, a patch of soil pressed down by a sandal. American units looked for moving bodies, bunkers, and active trails. The difference was subtle but critical. Americans searched for the enemy as a presence. Australians searched for the enemy as a pattern. This chapter also introduces how these approaches shaped morale and trust. American soldiers often admired the Australians' calm confidence in the bush. But they wondered how such slow, almost invisible movement could produce results. Australians, meanwhile, respected American bravery and their willingness to fight hard when contact came. But they questioned why anyone would risk giving the enemy early warning. One American sergeant once joked, "The Aussies don't fight the jungle, they become part of it." Meanwhile, an Australian corporal might say, "The Yanks aren't afraid of being seen. We're afraid of not seeing first." These small comments reveal something deeper: culture-shaped tactics. American forces were trained to be decisive, bold, and ready to adapt quickly. Australians were trained to be patient, careful, and prepared to avoid detection at all costs. The Viet Cong noticed these differences. They often knew when American units were moving through an area. They rarely knew when Australian patrols were close, until it was too late. As joint operations began, misunderstandings appeared. Australian officers sometimes advised American units to slow down, spread out, and listen more. American officers, in turn, believed the Australians wasted time that could be used for offensive action. Both sides were giving honest advice, but each was speaking from a different tradition. This chapter closes by showing the first cracks in perception. American commanders occasionally wrote reports noting the overly cautious nature of Australian methods. Australian officers quietly noted that American units were far too noisy. Yet on the ground, soldier to soldier, respect grew. Americans admired the Australians' ability to disappear in the jungle. Australians admired the Americans' courage and their ability to bring immense firepower when needed. Both armies were effective in their own ways. But early in the conflict, the United States often misread just how deadly the Australian bush style could be. They saw slowness where there was discipline. They saw hesitation where there was calculation. They saw caution where there was experience. What they didn't yet see was how this method would make Australian patrols some of the most feared by the Viet Cong. This is where the true story begins. Australian soldiers in Vietnam moved through the jungle with a level of silence that bordered on art. It wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It was training, discipline, and generations of lessons passed down from old bush fighters. Their methods looked unusual, even strange, to Allied forces who had never worked in such environments. But to the men who used them, these techniques were simply survival. The core of Australian bush tactics rested on one belief: if the enemy hears you first, you lose the advantage. If you hear the enemy first, you choose the fight. This chapter dives deep into the silence Australians carried, how they moved, how they spread out, how they used the terrain, and why Americans so often misunderstood these methods. A standard Australian patrol rarely exceeded 30 men. Most were closer to 20. This wasn't due to lack of manpower. It was done on purpose. A smaller unit could move with less noise, read more signs on the ground, and react faster. Spacing was strict. Soldiers often kept 5 meters or more between each other. In thick jungle, that distance felt far. Sometimes it felt like you were alone. But that spacing saved lives. A single claymore or burst of automatic fire might hit one soldier, but it couldn't mow down an entire squad. American patrols usually held tighter formations and moved with larger numbers. It made sense for their doctrine. They wanted mutual support and rapid response when ambushed. But from the Australian view, close spacing created a single, loud target. Imagine stepping onto a jungle trail. Leaves crush under your boots. Mosquitoes buzz by your ear. Vines grab your webbing. Every sound echoes in the damp air. Now imagine 20 men behind you, each making small noises. Metal shifting, equipment clicking, boots scraping bark. To an Australian, a patrol that moved too close together sounded like a warning bell ringing through the forest. Noise discipline wasn't just encouraged in Australian platoons, it was enforced. Loose gear was taped down. Water bottles were wrapped in cloth. Magazines were secured to prevent rattling. Even the clicking of a safety catch was controlled. Soldiers practiced releasing the safety in slow, silent motions. When they spoke, they whispered. When they moved carefully. Americans sometimes interpreted this quietness as fearfulness or overprotectiveness. But the truth was the opposite. Australian patrols moved silently because they planned to get close, dangerously close. That required nerves of steel. It required patience. It required the ability to hold a firing position for long minutes, sweating, shaking, and listening for any hint of movement. A young American lieutenant once asked an Australian patrol commander, "Why don't you just flush them out?" The Australian smiled and said, "Because flushing works both ways." Meaning, if you make noise to flush the enemy, you also let him know where you are. The difference in approach created real misunderstandings early in the war. Americans expected constant radio updates. Australians used radio only when necessary. Americans preferred momentum. Australians preferred invisibility. Americans saw danger in moving too slow. Australians saw danger in moving too fast. This chapter also explores how Australians use terrain with an almost instinctive sense of caution. In the jungle, movement was predictable along trails, dry creek beds, and narrow clearings. The Viet Cong knew that. So Australians treated every easy path as a potential kill zone. Instead of following the obvious route, they slipped into dense foliage, sidestepped the trail by 10 or 20 meters, and moved parallel to it. They watched the trail from the shadows. They scanned for fresh footprints, broken branches, or cooking smoke in the distance. To an American observer, this seemed like unnecessary complication. Why avoid the path designed for movement? Because Australians understood something critical. Comfort in the jungle often leads straight into an ambush. Another major difference was tempo. Australian patrols stopped often, sometimes every 20 steps, sometimes every few minutes. These halts served many purposes: listening, scanning, checking sign, ensuring spacing, adjusting direction. The jungle had its own language. Birds fell silent when something moved. The wind changed. A distant rustle could mean a deer, a boar, or a Viet Cong scout. Australians listened for those signals constantly. American patrols paused too, but not with the same frequency or intent. Their doctrine expected rapid movement to maintain pressure on the enemy. Pausing too much might break momentum. To Australians, not pausing was what invited danger. One American corporal once joked, "You Aussies move like ghosts." An Australian replied, "That's the idea." He wasn't trying to be clever, he was stating fact. Silence also shaped the mindset of Australian soldiers. When you move slowly for hours, barely speaking, senses sharpen. You start hearing every crack of a twig, every drop of water, every insect's wings. Hypervigilance becomes normal. Soldiers describe the feeling as being switched on, sometimes for entire days. It was mentally draining but necessary. The jungle punished distraction. American soldiers felt stress too, different stress. Their challenges came from heavy contact, large operations, and the constant threat of booby traps on high-traffic routes. They faced sudden violence, then overwhelming firepower. Australians faced the reverse. Long stretches of tension, then brief, close-range ambushes where the first second decided everything. The psychological load wasn't about more or less pressure, it was about different pressure. Australians lived inside a bubble of silence. Americans lived inside a bubble of noise. Neither bubble was easy. This chapter closes by showing how these differences created misreading between allies. American commanders sometimes viewed the Australians as too patient or too cautious. Australians quietly believed Americans were too loud and too quick to fire. In reality, both sides were simply applying their training. But the silence Australians carried, combined with their tracking skills and their instinct for the bush, made them far more threatening to the Viet Cong than American commanders initially understood. Australians didn't chase the enemy. They stalked him. They outweighted him. They let the jungle talk to them. And when the time came, they struck first. This silence would become the heart of Australian operations, something feared by Viet Cong scouts and often misunderstood by American allies. The Australian Army entered Vietnam with something the Americans didn't have: a long, inherited tradition of bush soldiering. It wasn't formal doctrine written in neat manuals. It was lived experience, passed down from generations of men who worked, hunted, and fought in rugged, natural terrain. This chapter explores how those lessons shaped Australian tactics and why Americans often misread them. The heart of bushcraft was simple. You survive by reading the land before the enemy does. To Australian soldiers, the jungle wasn't a barrier. It wasn't something to cut through or force a path across. It was a book. Every vine, track, broken twig, and disturbed patch of soil was a sentence. And if you knew how to read, you could understand exactly who passed through, when they passed, and where they were going. Americans rarely worked this way, not because they lacked skill, but because their war structure didn't require it. They moved in larger formations, relied on heavy firepower, and supported operations with artillery and air cover. A tracking pause, where a patrol stopped to study signs of enemy movement, was unusual for U.S. units. For Australians, it was routine. When a bush-trained forward scout found a footprint, progress slowed to almost nothing. The point man dropped low. The second scout compared the print's depth and direction. The patrol commander came forward silently. Together, they built a picture. Was the soil moist? Was the edge of the print sharp or soft? Had leaves settled into it? Was it a full track or a running step? These details told time. They told intent. They told danger. Americans sometimes misread these tracking pauses as hesitation. To them, it looked like the Australians were afraid to push forward. But in truth, the Australians were gathering intelligence in the most reliable way the jungle allowed, through ground sign. Tracking also created a unique tempo. A patrol might move 300 meters in an hour, sometimes less. But when they caught up to the Viet Cong, they caught them by surprise. The Australians rarely walked into ambushes. Instead, they were the ones setting them. This careful movement required trust. Every man depended on the scout in front of him. If the scout missed a tripwire, everyone could die. If he rushed, they could stumble into a bunker system. If he misread a track, the patrol could drift off course. American units also trusted their scouts, but the Australians gave their scouts far more decision power. Sometimes, the forward scout was practically steering the entire platoon. That level of responsibility created a different mindset. It made soldiers alert, thoughtful, and quiet. It also formed deep respect within the team. The scout wasn't just a job. He was a specialist, a lifeline. Bushcraft included more than tracking. Australians had a unique sense of movement shaped by their own geography. Many had grown up in rural areas, where long walks through scrub or forest were simply part of life. They knew how to judge distance without looking at a map. They understood how sound carried through trees. They learned how to blend into the bush without thinking about it. American officers sometimes saw this as improvisation or loose discipline. In their structure, clear orders were given, routes were set, and timings were calculated. Australian units often operated with more flexible intent. The commanding officer described what needed to be done, but the patrol commander decided how to do it based on terrain, sign, and instinct. This flexibility could confuse American observers. They sometimes believed the Australians were making it up as they went. But Australians weren't making it up. They were adapting in real time, allowing the land itself to shape the plan. Imagine walking through thick scrub with vines grabbing at your ankles. Imagine humidity wrapping around you like a blanket. Imagine the sting of sweat running into your eyes. Now imagine doing this slowly, deliberately, for hours, while constantly scanning the ground for enemy sign. The work was exhausting, mentally and physically, but this slow, detailed movement paid off. Australians often detected bunker systems before entering them. They discovered fresh cooking sites, newly cut bamboo, or scuffed earth leading to hidden caches. They identified enemy tracks that Americans might have missed, simply because Americans moved faster and focused on broader operational objectives. One American commander remarked, "The Australians never seem in a hurry." Another Australian replied, "We're not. The jungle isn't going anywhere." Bush tactics had another side, one that made Americans uneasy. Australians deliberately sought close-range contact, not reckless contact, not frontal charges, but controlled, surprise contact where they struck first. This preference came directly from Bush warfare traditions. When you stalk an enemy, close distance increases your odds of success. Surprise becomes your weapon. Firepower becomes follow-through. Americans preferred standoff distance. They used fire superiority, artillery, and airstrikes to reduce enemy strength before infantry moved in. Australians used these assets too, but often after contact, not before. To Australians, firing early was a mistake. It revealed your position. It removed your advantage. So they waited. They let VC fighters get close. Sometimes within 20 meters, sometimes within 10. An American sergeant once asked an Australian patrol leader, "How do you keep your men from shooting early?" The Australian shrugged, "Training and trust." He wasn't exaggerating. Soldiers practiced fire discipline constantly. They learned to control their breathing. They learned to keep a steady trigger finger even when adrenaline surged. They learned to hold fire until the patrol commander's signal. This signal varied: a whispered command, a tap on the shoulder, a hand gesture, and it had to be clear, fast, and calm. Sometimes the commander didn't give a signal. Sometimes the forward scout fired first because he saw immediate danger. But even then, the rest of the platoon fired only after identifying targets. This selective firing puzzled American observers. U.S. doctrine encouraged overwhelming fire to suppress the enemy. Australian doctrine encouraged accurate, low-volume bursts that preserved ammunition and reduced noise. These different philosophies created different battlefield outcomes. Americans often dominated large engagements. Australians dominated small ones. This chapter ends with one key point. Americans didn't misread Australian bush tactics because they were wrong. They misread them because they came from a different world, a different military culture, and a different relationship with the land. Australians weren't slow. They weren't cautious. They were methodical. They weren't avoiding contact. They were shaping it. They didn't rely on luck. They relied on skill. And in the jungles of Vietnam, that skill, honed by decades of bushcraft, made them one of the most effective light infantry forces in the region. The next morning came without sunlight. In the jungle, dawn was only a slight change in darkness, a shift from black to deep gray. The Australians were already awake. They had slept in short bursts, lying in shallow scrapes, rifles in their hands, helmets still on. No talking, no coughing, no movement unless absolutely needed. They welcomed the quiet because quiet meant control. Quiet meant they still owned the initiative, but deep inside that green wall, something was changing. The Viet Cong division, spread across a wide area, was on the move. Their scouts pushed forward, trying to understand who had shadowed them for 2 days. The Australians didn't know it yet, but the division was starting to close a loose circle around them. Not a trap, not a planned ambush, just a natural tightening as hundreds of men shifted routes, adjusted formations, and followed orders. This was the danger of tracking a large force. At any moment you could simply be in the way of something enormous. The patrol commander sensed this. Experience replaced fear. He whispered along the line, spread out further, 10 meters each. No noise. They moved like ghosts. 10 men stretched into a long, thin, silent thread weaving between thick trees. Every step mattered. Heel down, toe down, weight lowered slowly. The jungle floor was scattered with dry leaves, broken branches, and hidden roots. One loud crack could echo. One misstep could give away the entire patrol. The Australians were trained to avoid that mistake. They used hand signals only, a closed fist for stop, 2 fingers pointing left for eyes on, a slow wave down for take a knee. No one spoke unless absolutely required. Even their breathing was controlled, slow in, slow out. By mid-morning they found the first sign, a small break in a fern line, a footprint. Light, narrow, made by a sandal, Viet Cong, fresh. One of the scouts studied it. He didn't say anything. Instead, he tapped the patrol commander's arm and pointed. They all crouched, watching the ground as if it were a map. The pattern was clear. A point scout had passed through less than an hour earlier. That meant the main body couldn't be far behind. The Australians moved again, even slower now. Their senses sharpened. Sweat dripped, but no one wiped it. Insects crawled across their arms, but no one brushed them away. Every man carried around 30 to 35 kilograms. Water, ammo, radio batteries, rations, medical gear. The weight dug into their shoulders, but they marched on quietly. Around midday they heard something faint. Not a voice, not a shout, just a soft, rhythmic thump. Boots. No, sandals, many of them. The Australians melted into cover, lying flat, rifles aimed but still. They didn't want to fight. Their mission was intelligence. Stay hidden, track, report. A dark shape appeared ahead between two large trees, then another, and another. Viet Cong soldiers, a small unit, maybe 6 or 7 men, walking casually. Their rifles hung low. They weren't expecting contact. They weren't moving tactically. This wasn't a patrol. It was a forward element of something bigger. The Australians didn't move. Not even a twitch. The Viet Cong walked past them, so close the Australians could hear the creak of their webbing and smell the sweat drying on their uniforms. For a moment it seemed the entire jungle held its breath. Then 2 more appeared, then 5, then a group of 10. The Australians realized what they were seeing, a column, not the full division but one of its big components. Dozens of enemy soldiers walked through the forest in a long, loose line, all armed, all relaxed, none aware they were passing meters from trained reconnaissance troops. One Australian rifleman later described it as watching a river of men flow by. It took almost 20 minutes for the column to pass. 20 long, tense minutes lying perfectly still in the dirt. When the last man disappeared into the jungle, the Australians stayed down for another 5 minutes. Noise discipline demanded it. Patience kept them alive. Finally, the patrol commander raised one finger. Move. They shifted into a new direction, tracking parallel to the enemy force but never crossing their path. They wanted to keep their distance, at least 300 to 500 meters away, close enough to observe, far enough to avoid accidental discovery. The undergrowth thickened, vines hung low, roots twisted across the ground. Every step became a slow dance between silence and balance. The Australians adjusted their spacing again. 10 meters wasn't enough anymore. The jungle was too dense. They spread to 15 meters. It reduced the risk of losing the entire patrol if an ambush happened. Small teams could break away, regroup, and survive. Afternoon heat sucked the energy out of them. Their shirts were soaked. Packs felt heavier. But this was the job. Move quietly for hours with no rest, no sound, no comfort. They stayed sharp because sharpness was survival. By late afternoon, they found something even more alarming, a staging area. Freshly broken branches. A resting spot. Hundreds of sandal prints crisscrossing a small clearing. The division had stopped here recently, maybe earlier that same day. The patrol commander studied the ground. He knew they were deep inside the enemy's temporary territory. The division could shift back at any time. Scouts could return. Movement could reverse. They were threading a needle inside a giant machine. Still, the Australians pushed forward. They found a small rise, a piece of higher ground that gave them a partial view through the thick trees. They set up an observation point. Quietly, slowly. Every man took a position with a field of fire, even though they hoped they'd never need it. Then just before dusk, a soft sound drifted toward them. Voices, many voices, calm, unhurried. The Viet Cong were settling in for the night somewhere close. Maybe a few hundred meters, maybe less. The Australians watched the shifting shadows through gaps in the foliage. They couldn't see the enemy clearly, but they could hear metal clinking, fires being prepared, quiet laughter, signs of a force that believed it was safe. The patrol commander leaned close to his men and whispered, barely audible, "Stay low, Stay hidden. They don't know we're here. The night closed in fast. The green jungle faded into black. This was the most dangerous time. Darkness belonged to the Viet Cong. They knew the forest better. They moved confidently after sunset. They enjoyed the advantage. But tonight the Australians were already inside their perimeter. They weren't running. They weren't lost. They were watching, learning, preparing. The Viet Cong didn't realize the threat sitting quietly in the shadows, eyes open, rifles still, breath controlled. The trap wasn't closing on the Australians. The Australians were studying how to build one of their own. And soon, all that intelligence would be used in one decisive moment. A moment that would show exactly why American commanders struggled to understand Australian bush tactics. A moment that would change the battle entirely.